Number 5. What does it mean to be justified by faith? In the series, Faith, Righteousness, and Salvation, by Graham Maxwell, recorded February 20, 1975.
Last time we were looking particularly at Romans 3:25 and thereabouts. To me, the clearest explanation in the Bible as to why Jesus had to die. And as one member of the class carefully balanced it last time, nobody was forcing him to do it in that sense that he had to. It's just there was no other way. But that all depends on our understanding of the meaning of his death. Understood in a certain way, nobody else could do it. When I think that question through for myself, the answer that satisfies me most as to why no one else could do it is simply that the questions were not about anybody else. The questions were about God. More than that, God, being the kind of person that he is, would never think of asking someone else to answer those questions for him, since it involved so much suffering, involved him dying that awful death, plus the fact that nobody else could do it. There'd be no way that anyone else could do it anyway. Only God could do this. There are many reasons why. Only the person who came could be the one to do it. No one else could possibly have done it. Now, that there had to be a death can be explained in so many ways, some of which I think put God in a rather bad light, as if the death were necessary to somehow adjust our legal status in the sight of God. But on the other hand, there are explanations of the death of Christ that speak more eloquently of the truth about God and his way of governing this universe than anything else by far. And one can leave the foot of the cross, having observed the clearest revelation of the truth about God, the nature of his heavenly society, and the consequences of choosing to be disorderly in God's orderly universe, the clearest revelation that the universe will ever see. Not to mention the answers to Satan's charges against God and the resolving of any remaining questions there might be lingering among God's loyal people throughout this universe, either about him or about the great adversary. In many questions were answered and many problems were solved by the death of Jesus. And had they not been solved, there would have been no way for us to be saved. Not for legal reasons, but it just could not have been done. And we need to go into that in more detail. And this is why truly salvation comes by faith. We don't solve any of these problems ourselves. We don't answer any of these questions ourselves. God has done it all by himself. All we have to do is look over the evidence that he has thereby provided and make up our minds as to whether or not, in the light of all that God has done, he is worthy of our faith. It sounds terrible to put it that way. Imagine sitting here deciding whether or not God is worthy of our faith. Well, the devil said in the Garden of Eden he's not, didn't he? He said God is a liar. He has not told you the truth. And so he told the angels in the beginning. At a worship with the elementary teachers this morning at Loma Linda, we were looking over some of the descriptions by Ellen White of Satan's whole purpose in the great controversy. And she's so specific about Satan's purpose being to misrepresent the character of God, the character of Christ, and the nature of God's government. And she specifies so many ways in which he has done this. And his great goal now is to lead us, while apparently believing in God and all the provisions of the plan of salvation, to so misunderstand these that in effect we agree with him. She even says at the bottom of a page we read that most of the Christian churches have sided with Satan against God. And yet they're called Christian and apparently are on God's side and maybe believe they are. Plus her statement, is it any wonder that there are so many thousands, yes, millions of atheists, agnostics, and skeptics in the world who fear and even hate God, when you consider how he has been falsely represented from the pulpit? And then you wonder if everybody else has done this, but not we. Have we done it? Have we ever misrepresented God? Even the death of Christ can be so explained as to put God in a very bad light.
Could God have won the controversy if Christ had chosen not to come?
Because that hypothesis is hard to wrap one's mind around, isn't it? Because it would imply a whole lot of other things that would just cause it all to crumble. One could consider, it's true, that hypothesis and a lot of others that sometimes occur to me at odd moments. I'm glad that historically he did come. That's where the evidence lies, and I can think about the others. Sometimes I enjoy thinking about the others. I mean, there is a kind of sanctified speculation, I hope, isn't there? Because sometimes, having thought of the alternatives, one feels so very grateful as to how it really did work out in history. So it helps, I think. This is the way he did choose to do it. Now, as it mentions in Romans 3:25, and this is the connection with our discussion of justification this evening, that in connection with this demonstration that God is righteous, there is his justifying of the sinner who has faith in Jesus Christ. So that the death of Christ is tied to our own being set right, as well as God being recognized as right. And that's where we have to get into the subject tonight. A little more, though, since I have the quotations here on destruction this evening, regarding the eloquence of his death in answering Satan's charges. Apparently, from Romans 3:25, the righteousness of God has been called in question before the universe because of his apparent overlooking of men's former sins in his divine forbearance. Do you have a variety of translations for that? Right there in the middle of 3:25, the Greek can mean very readily that the death of Christ was to show the righteousness of God, because in his divine forbearance he had apparently overlooked men's former sins. And the devil, you see, cited that as an evidence that God had lied when he said they would die, we would die. He says, you won't die. So God's grace and his granting us probationary time has been thrown back in his face as evidence that he does not tell the truth. Now, that could be rendered in so many ways. Do you have others that are significantly different? In 3:25. Yes?
Well, I have here 26 translations.
Oh.
I don't think I should get into it, but I
Yes.
have one of them here.
Well, some of those phrases you have good alternatives for in there. Do you know this version? The New Testament from 26 translations. And the author has chosen the variations that he has deemed significant. It's a very good study version, isn't it?
To make clear his righteousness, when in his pity, God let the sins of the earlier times go without punishment.
What version did that?
That's the New Testament in basic English.
Yes, that's a very interesting version, by the way. It limited itself to, they tried to limit themselves to 1,000 words. They had to stretch it a little. So basic English, just the simplest words possible. Imagine translating Romans 3 in basic English. They did a fine job on that, don't you think? Give us another one.
The Berkeley version says, which was for vindication of his righteousness in forgiving the sins that previously were committed under God's forbearance.
Similar. Do you have any others? Do you have any that differ from that significantly? You notice that the necessity for demonstrating God's righteousness is his overlooking men's former sins. And with Ellen White to help us, we understand that clearly, don't we? That in putting us, as it were, on probationary time, God has not seemed to carry through with his warning that we would die. In mercy, we have been under grace, not under law. If we were under law, we would be reaping the perfectly proper consequences of our lawlessness, and we wouldn't be here. But we're under grace. God is gracious toward us. But his graciousness has been cited as evidence of divine duplicity here, which is so unfair of Satan, but he'll stoop to anything to put God in a bad light. Now, how did the death of Christ answer the questions about God's telling the truth when he said, in the day that you eat thereof you will die? Or whatever he may have said to the angels in the beginning, if you choose to be disorderly and rebellious in my universe, you will die. What causes the death of the sinner? And did this cause the death of Christ? the separation. And we can see that with Jesus, as we discussed last time, for he cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" How about, though, at the end of the millennium? We didn't have time to go into this more. The death seems to come as a result of fire coming down from God out of heaven. This doesn't seem to be the same sort of experience at all. What causes the consuming of the wicked at the end of the millennium? Yes.
I think that all of those terrible things where it talks about the angels pouring out the vials, that these are the natural consequences of living disorderly lives in an orderly universe.
What would be the cause of the fire, maybe, if we can presume? The Lord has not been concerned to explain in detail how this is going to happen, but do we have some evidence?
My speculation is hydrogen warfare of some kind.
Yes.
But that's only
Would God be setting off the bombs?
No, but that's...
But you mean something of that nature, something nuclear, you mean, maybe?
It's probable at this point in history is what we have available. I mean, we have the capability of destroying ourselves 10 times over.
All right, let's consider that some more. Yes.
We discussed this after class. Elder Rich and myself and somebody else discussed this a bit after class last time. And we discussed the text that said some will burn in a moment and some will linger on, and Satan himself will linger long after all the rest has been destroyed and so forth. I kind of speculated that perhaps they would die because of the separation, but the fire would be just a matter of cleaning up the mess. When Christ died, his body was still there. So it would be a good way to just cremate everything around and get rid of the mess we got to recreate.
Well, on the first point, on the separation, we touched on this last time, and I think it's so important. Well, it affects our view of God so much that it can't be overlooked. The many references to God's wrath. We picture him as so infinitely gracious, and yet we have all the references to his wrath. I believe each of us does need, if we purport to present the third angel's message, which is the most fearsome description of God pouring out his wrath and the fire that follows, we therefore, if we're going to give that message, have got to be able to explain this in such a way that it is seen to be consistent with the picture of our infinitely gracious God. That is, if God has seen fit to reveal enough to us that we can venture to explain this. Or will we go out to the world and say, this is the third angel's message. This is our last great message to the world, but don't ask us to explain it. It doesn't make sense to us either. It hardly seems possible. It wouldn't go with much power. So can we explain it in the light of the gospel of the first angel's message, the good news about God? Can we explain the third angel's message? Later on, I'd like to spend a whole session on the three angels' messages. But in continuity with our discussion last time, do you feel there's enough said about God's wrath? A word that is human, and everything that is human is imperfect. And as Ellen White is very candid to admit, the Bible is written in human language, not grand, superhuman language. It's not heavenly language. A person will say, this expression does not sound like God. Oh, she says, God has not put himself on record in rhetoric in the Scriptures. Graciously, he has used our language, or we wouldn't understand a word of it. And we have the word wrath. We have the word anger. We have some other synonyms for this. God has used the best words he could find. And it's more difficult in some other languages, by the way. When translating from the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek into some languages of very limited vocabulary, you ought to see the extent to which the translators have to go to convey the picture, which can come over in one word into English. A wonderful book on that is God's Word in Man's Language by Eugene A. Nida, Secretary for Versions of the American Bible Society. You can't even say, behold, I stand at the door and knock in some societies because only a thief knocks. You have to reword it. A friend stands and calls so you can recognize the voice and know whether to open the door or not. So that verse has to be changed. That verse for which we have artists' paintings, of Christ standing and knocking, you don't hang that picture in some cultures. That means he's a thief. It has to be, behold, I stand at the door and call. The meaning is the same. That's a relatively simple example. What would you do with justification? in some cultures. The only thing that was available in one culture was a phrase that described breaking the yoke around the neck of a poor native who had been seized by the slave traders and was on his way to the boat to be shipped to elsewhere in the world. And if that yoke should be broken and the individual set free, that's the closest they could come to justification. There were no other words for it. So God has used human language, and under inspiration we have the words for wrath. But what is wrath? I think without God explaining and demonstrating, we wouldn't know for sure, because the dictionary has many explanations for this, many meanings for it. That's why Romans 1, that we looked at last time, seems so significant to me. Maybe it would be worth glancing at it again in a little more detail, because if you go back far enough in Romans 1, you come to our famous key text about the gospel of which Paul was so proud. 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, the good news of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation or healing. That is, this good news about God has great power. That is, to everyone who has faith. Of course, if we don't trust the message, it isn't going to do us any good. To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, that is, in the gospel, in the good news, is revealed something that has great power to heal people. And you notice what it is? The righteousness of God. The substance of the good news is the righteousness of God. What is the greatest demonstration of the righteousness of God the universe will ever see? Romans 3:25. But the unique and awful death of Christ. So we must read that death correctly. That's the chief evidence God has provided that he is a righteous God. There's much more besides, of course. Now, in verse 18, having said that the good news which we're to take to every nation under heaven that the end may come, the good news that the first angel carries with him, in verse 18 it says, for the wrath of God is revealed. Has he changed the subject from the good news in 16 and 17 to some other subject? And he stays on the subject of wrath to the very end of the chapter. He says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their wickedness suppress the truth, it can be translated. The most wicked thing a person does, because it's so destructive for himself and for others, is to twist and pervert and suppress the truth. Isn't that precisely what Satan did in the beginning? And of course, the truth is the truth about God. Because that which may be known about God, see, that's what the truth is. That which may be known about God is made manifest to them, for God has shown it to them. For the invisible things about God. Well, I'm looking at a version here, and I want to translate it for myself from the Greek as I look at it. Do you see the argument in this verse that they're without excuse because God, in the things that he has made, has revealed enough about himself, that those who deny his existence, pervert the truth about him, are without excuse. Because when they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, neither were thankful. But instead of relating themselves to God in this way, praising him for being the kind of person he was, and being so grateful that he is as he is, and not as Satan has made him out to be. And aren't you grateful for that? Because they gave this up and accepted Satan's picture of God, or other incredible substitutes for the truth about God, they became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. God didn't darken them, they became dark. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Even beetles down in Egypt, like the scarab you brought home. Could you imagine kneeling down and praying to a beetle? How about a louse, a fly, a frog? How about all the things the Egyptians knelt down to worship? A crocodile? And as you know, one of the main reasons for the 10 plagues in Egypt was to demonstrate the impotence of the Egyptian gods. How could you kill frogs all day and sweep them up into piles in the evening and then kneel down that evening with your family and pray, "Dear Lord Frog, bless Mommy and bless Daddy, do look after us." And here's the frog under a pile of other frogs. It was to make the religion of the Egyptians seem as ridiculous as it was, that maybe they would look to the true God. Many got the message, didn't they? And came out with the Israelites. But can you imagine the effect on a person's mind when he would rather pray to a fly than to our infinitely intelligent, gracious God? What would have to happen to you before you could kneel down and pray to a fly? Do you remember in Kings, it says that the king was consulting Beelzebub, the god of flies. It seems incredible, but even just take Dagon, the fish god. Could you imagine kneeling down to that image? And when they came in the morning and Dagon was lying flat on his face before the ark, they felt no difficulty in propping him back up on the pedestal and praying, "Look after us." You know, they had to prop him up first. And then the next morning, you remember when Dagon had fallen on his face and shattered into pieces? Apparently they were able to glue him together and put him back up and say, "Please do look after us. You're so much more powerful than we are." You know, how could you do it? Obviously, something has happened to the mind. Wherefore, God did something, it says. Did he punish them? Did he beat them up? What do you do to people? Suppose you were God and had revealed yourself as the kind of person we know God to be. I mean, having such respect for people's freedom and asking nothing of them that is not for their best good. To be intelligent, happy, healthy people. And rather than worship you and follow your advice as their creator, they'd rather go out and pray to a frog or a louse or a fly. And what would you do to people like that? Isn't that just the point here? Wherefore, God gave them up. Can you force people to love you anyway, to trust you? It can't be done. So God gave them up. But what happened when he gave them up? To uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And you know how that's been done in history. And what was it that they did that was so damaging? They changed the truth about God into a lie. And isn't that what the great controversy is all about? Do you remember when Jesus was working up to a great climax in his presentation of the truth about God? And finally he said, if you knew the truth would set you free. And doesn't the truth about God have that effect? And you remember how they resisted and objected, and finally they said, do we not say correctly that you have a devil? Oh, on the contrary, he said, you are of your father the devil. He was a liar from the beginning, and his lies were all about God. So here are people who changed the truth about God into a lie. And here's the evidence that they had done it. They worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And isn't that absurd? Here you have an infinitely powerful person who can create even human beings. And you'd rather worship the thing he has made than the Creator himself. There's no logic to it. There's no sense to sin. For this cause, again, God gave them up. And when he gives people up and ceases to protect and restrain people who don't want to be protected anyway, look what happens. Unto vile affections. And as you know, what follows between here and the end of the chapter is unspeakable. But this is what happens to people when God gives them up to what they want to do. Drop to 28. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God again for the third time gave them over, or gave them up, and look what they were like, as described. When God gives people up, the predicament they're in is hardly readable in public. Now, is this related to the good news? Or has Paul changed the subject? Or is this an explanation of God's wrath? See, it doesn't tell about his being angry with anybody, does it? It simply says, in the only places where it mentions God doing something, you see, it says his wrath is poured out, and you look for him to do something to show how angry he is. It doesn't say anything about his being angry. It simply says 3 times, God gave them up. And then, if one has the Old Testament ringing in his ears, you can't help but remember Hosea, where God says through the prophet, Israel is bent on leaving me, so I will let them go. But how can I give you up? How can I let you go? And then you remember many other places. So many of the writers in the Old Testament refer to God giving people up. In his free universe, that's what he does for people. And there's no need for him to punish people in addition to the consequences. When a person has drunk poison and dying, does he need to be punished too? Is there any need to execute him? He's going to die anyway. The sinner is going to die anyway. Why add to his suffering? What would the purpose be? Is not the dying enough? Or what are the consequences of God's giving a person up in his universe? Well, we see it with Jesus, and Romans 4:25 says explicitly that God gave him up, and it's the identical word as I mentioned last time. Paradidomi, to give over, to give up, to turn over. So the same word in Romans 1, in those three places, 24, 26, and 28, the very word used there, translated, God gave them up. That's the very same word in Romans 4:25. The Father gave up the Son. And the clinching evidence, I think, is the Son's response to being given up. How appropriately. Why hast thou forsaken me? Why have you given me up? And he died. That's clear enough, but then we have the fire at the end, which might seem to be more difficult. What is this fire? Is this anything comparable to God's wrath, which according to the dictionary would mean that he is furiously angry with us and we richly deserve it? Is it possible that fire is just his lighting one enormous blowtorch and burning everybody up at the end? Do we have any information about God and his glory that might suggest to us what the fire could be? You remember many verses in Scripture. When God appeared on Mount Sinai, what did his glory look like? You remember it had the appearance of fire. It doesn't say it was fire. It had the appearance of fire. You remember, because going through the book by book, Bible book by book, many of us, you can remember the places. Do you remember in Ezekiel, the wheels within the wheels? And Ezekiel saw God. He saw the face that looked like the face of a human being. And when it was all through, he said, such was the likeness of the appearance of the glory of God. He simply couldn't describe it. But he saw fire. When Isaiah was given a glimpse of God, he saw the glory and he saw the fire. You remember when Daniel had a glimpse of heaven when the court sat in judgment and the books were open in Daniel 7? The throne was fiery flames, the wheels were burning fire, and a stream of fire issued and came forth from before him. Many places in the Bible where the glory of God is described as having the appearance of fire. In the beginning, was it possible for human beings to live in that glory? Did Lucifer originally live in this unveiled glory of God? Do you remember in Ezekiel where he's described as walking among the stones of fire, right in the very presence of God? To him it was life-giving glory. To Adam and Eve it was life-giving glory. Now it's hard for us to have words to describe his glory. If it has anything to do with power, what words do we have to describe power that can speak, and not just one planet comes into being, but a whole solar system? And then if you read the National Geographic, the statistics are unable to measure the size of our universe, you remember. The thing that impressed me most was the description, and the scientists don't know what to do with them, of these dark spots where large suns have imploded, and 1 teaspoon would weigh as much as, how many elephants was it? It's an incredible amount. And if you rolled that little tiny bit up into a ball and dropped it, it would pass right through the earth and out the other side. We have no statistics that make sense to us. What kind of a person and what kind of power would be required to create this whole vast universe in which we live? And this power of God is represented in one way by this unspeakable glory that surrounds his person, this energy. And Adam and Eve could walk in this unveiled glory. The moment Adam and Eve sinned, God veiled his glory. Ellen White makes many interesting comments on this. She says, when Adam and Eve sinned, the light of God went out from the face of nature. And this earth became a dark place. You remember when Ellen White came out of vision? Having seen glory, she would say this earth is a dark place. Moses asked God if he could see his face, as we were discussing last time. And when God said to Moses, no man can see my face and live, he didn't mean I'll kill you if I catch you peeking. This makes God seem so little. Is it actually true that human beings in the condition we're in now actually cannot live in the life-giving presence of our gracious God? The glory of him who is love would consume us. So God in his mercy has veiled his glory. There might be moments in biblical history when he appears to have unveiled it. And you recall what happened. By the way, can we even see an angel? Even the reflected glory of an angel is so brilliant that human beings would be consumed by the reflected glory of an angel. And speaking of reflection, God did allow Moses to come very close to him. You remember he said, I'll put you in a cleft in the rock and I'll put my hand over you and I'll pass by and let you see my back. And when Moses came down from the mountain, did he bring a description of God's back? He brought a description of God's character, but he reflected so much of the glory of God that he had to wear a veil out of consideration for the people. So this is real. It can be reflected. It's described as life-giving. But to those who are out of harmony with God, the life-giving glory is destructive. That's the way it is in our universe. And here's where the separation comes in. We are dependent upon this life-giving glory for life, as I understand it, just as we were dependent on it for creation in the first place. But we have to be veiled from this life-giving glory now. And if you wonder what this has done to us, just imagine if Adam and Eve should walk in now. Magnificent beings, more than twice as tall as men now living, 20 times the vital force that we have, and the best-looking ones among us would look like disasters in comparison. We have paid a heavy price for this, and look what's happened to life, how short. What has it done to nature around us? Our world is seriously mutilated. In fact, I'm inclined to think that the veiling of God's glory may have wrought as many changes on this planet as the flood, and may explain a lot of the things that the flood does not explain, and that many scientists are having trouble with right now. Some of the age dating problems, maybe go back to that rather than to the flood. Many of the consequences of these changes in the beginning were buried in the flood. So I have lots of room for all the things that scientists are honestly turning up now. I think we have enough information from Revelation to accommodate all these things, though we can't handle them in detail. The Lord would rather have us concentrate on the plan of salvation, and after we're healed and have all eternity to study it, we can work on these other problems. They are much less important. We hope someday to be so healed and restored that we can live in that life-giving glory again. And who would desire this more than the Father, who cannot come to this earth as he is? In fact, you recall it said of Christ, he veiled the dazzling splendor of his divinity, that human beings might come to know God without being consumed. Don't you think just that one sentence is specific enough and is the key to the whole thing? You see, Christ veiled the dazzling splendor of his divinity, that human beings might come to know God without being consumed. Had he come in his glory, he would have consumed the very people he came to instruct and save. So he came as a human being. That's as much as we can see of God. And yet he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But according to Revelation, or even Thessalonians, when he comes back next time, does he come with his glory veiled? No, and since he comes in his life-giving glory, what is the effect on the wicked? Yeah, they're slain by the brightness of his coming. But what about the righteous? Are they even afraid? No, they say, this is our God, we have waited for him, and he will save us. When he comes back at the end of the millennium, in all his unveiled glory and surrounded by these glorious beings in their unveiled reflected glory, what will be the effect on this planet? Will not everything out of harmony be consumed? In fact, Peter says, if we want to make this just a mental experience, it isn't going to fit Peter. He says the very elements will melt with fervent heat. In these quotations on destruction, I've tried to collect some representative statements from Ellen White, who said, of course, as you know, a great deal more than this, regarding the destruction of sinners. There is sometimes a view expressed that God is so gracious that he never would terminate the life of anybody. And so even the death of the firstborn in Egypt must have been done by Satan, who, in order to fulfill God's prophecy through Moses, very accommodatingly took the lives of the firstborn, which just doesn't seem to be typical of Satan. The death of the 185,000 Assyrians that lifted the siege of Jerusalem. Do you think Satan was so obliging? Did Satan destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Did he open up the earth and swallow up Korah, Dathan, and Abiram? How about the fire that came forth from God when Nadab and Abihu staggered drunk into the tabernacle and offered God a potion of their own mixture in drunken rebelliousness? I can't see Satan always doing God's, doesn't sound like a nice way to say it, God's dirty work for him. He's not going to cooperate. He'd rather have God look like a false prophet when he said, "Tonight the firstborn in Egypt will die." So there are many cases where destruction is an act of God or his angels. But I think you'll notice, you go through, that these acts of destruction never pertain to the second death. It's always the first death, from which there's a resurrection. I mean, God ordered the stoning of Achan, as I understand it, but there's a resurrection from that. And it will be seen clearly at the end whether any of those who died, or maybe one of the 185,000 Assyrians was safe to say, well, he'll rise in the resurrection and be ushered into the kingdom. That is not the ultimate end. And I would certainly be willing to leave it up to God to terminate our lives whenever he wishes according to his own gracious purpose. And as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. But the end, the final eternal death, does God there actively destroy people? Well, note there are many quotations here on destruction being an act of God or his angels. Then destruction as an act of Satan or his angels on page 3. Some explicit statements about Satan destroying. Then the third group, destruction as suicide, the natural consequences of persisting in sin. We destroy ourselves. And how often we do this and no one has to move a hand. We destroy ourselves. Significant statements there we'll come back to later when we talk about the Minneapolis General Conference. Then on page 4, destruction as the result of the removal of God's protection. Didn't we see that in the Old Testament books? When God removed his protection from people who didn't want it anyway, the results were very serious. But it's page 5 that pertains particularly to the end of the millennium and the third angel's message. Now, in the collection, you have just the heart of the presentation in Desire of Ages, 763 to 764. This is taken from the whole chapter, It Is Finished, in Desire of Ages. Let me read the preamble to this paragraph chosen for the collection. To the angels and the unfallen worlds, the cry of Jesus on the cross, "It is finished," had a deep significance. It was for them, as well as us, that the great work of redemption had been accomplished. Not until the death of Christ was the character of Satan clearly revealed to the angels or to the unfallen worlds. The arch-apostate had so clothed himself with deception that even holy beings had not understood his principles. Even though he had been the highest of all created beings and had been foremost in revealing God's purpose to the universe, he really was the light bearer, foremost in revealing God's purpose to the universe. Now he is teaching things about God that are wrong. God, it goes on, could have destroyed Satan and his sympathizers as easily as one can cast a pebble to the earth. But he did not do this. Rebellion was not to be overcome by force. Compelling power is found only under Satan's government. The Lord's principles are not of this order. His authority rests upon goodness, mercy, and love. And the presentation of these principles is the means to be used. Now, presentation means explanation. It means teaching. And Jesus came as the teacher. Master means teacher. He came to explain the goodness, the mercy, and the love of God. This is God's way of winning all that he can, all who are willing to listen throughout his vast universe. Of all the evidence that God presented through Jesus about his goodness, his mercy, his love, his righteousness, his truthfulness, the unique and awful death of Jesus was the most eloquent. Now, how did this answer any questions? With all heaven and the unfallen worlds had been witness to the controversy, with what intense interest did they follow the closing scenes of the conflict. As the Father's presence was withdrawn, they saw him sorrowful with a bitterness of sorrow exceeding that of the last great struggle with death. Heaven beheld the victim betrayed into the hands of the murderous mob. It heard the sneers of his persecutors. It heard the denial with cursing and swearing by one of his best-loved disciples. Heaven saw the frenzied work of Satan. Heaven viewed with grief and amazement Christ hanging upon the cross. All heaven was filled with one. Maybe we don't get the message, but the universe did. Maybe we have trouble with Judges, but the universe got the message from that book. All heaven was filled with wonder when the prayer of Christ was offered in the midst of his terrible suffering, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Yet there stood man formed in the image of God, joining to crush out the life of his only Son. What a sight for the heavenly universe! The principalities and powers of darkness were assembled around the cross, casting the hellish shadow of unbelief into the hearts of men, even looking at Jesus dying. When the Lord created these beings to stand before his throne, they were beautiful and glorious. Their loveliness and holiness were in accordance with their exalted station. They were enriched with the wisdom of God and girded with the panoply of heaven. They were Jehovah's ministers. But who would recognize in the fallen angels the glorious seraphim that once ministered in the heavenly courts? Do you notice in this chapter it is finished? She's talking most about the universe, much more, in fact, about the onlooking universe. His death was to say something to them. His death was to explain the truthfulness of God's words. If you choose to be sinful and rebellious and disorderly in my orderly universe, you will die. But not at my hands. I will not execute you. My Son will show you what I mean. And he died that awful death. Now, coming clear over to the end, Ellen White speaks of the fact that since the questions about God have all been answered, he may now allow the wicked to reap the consequences that Satan and his followers did not reap in the beginning. And the consequences are described in the paragraph in front of us here. Then the end will come. God will vindicate his law and deliver his people. Satan and all who have joined him in rebellion will be cut off. Sin and sinners will perish, root and branch, Satan the root and his followers the branches. But this is not an act of arbitrary power on the part of God. He's never done it that way before. He's not going to do it now. Then why do they die? Why are they burned? The rejectors of his mercy reap that which they have sown. God is the fountain of life, and when one chooses the service of sin, he separates from God and thus cuts himself off from life. He is alienated from the life of God. Christ says, "All they that hate me love death." God gives them existence for a time, we call that probation, that they may develop their character and reveal their principles. This accomplished, they receive, that should be the present tense, the results of their own choice. By a life of rebellion, Satan and all who unite with him place themselves so out of harmony with God that his very presence is to them a consuming fire. The glory of him who is love will destroy them. Now, reading on in Desire of Ages, it says, at the beginning, this very next line, at the beginning of the great controversy, the angels did not understand this. And this is the paragraph we've just read. They didn't understand the nature of this awful death that is the consequence of sin. Had Satan and his host then been left to reap the full result of their sin, they would have perished. But it would not have been apparent to heavenly beings that this was the inevitable result of sin. They would have assumed that God had executed them as the wicked deserve. No, it's the inevitable result of sin, and they would not have seen this, would not have understood this, because they had never seen death. A doubt of God's goodness would have remained in their minds as evil seed to produce its deadly fruit of sin and woe. But not so when the great controversy shall be ended. Then, the plan of redemption having been completed, the character of God is revealed to all created intelligences. Then sin has made manifest its nature, that it is poison, that it destroys us, you see. Satan, his character, whereas the precepts of God's law seem to be perfect and immutable. Then the extermination of sin will vindicate God's love and establish his honor before a universe of beings who delight to do his will, and in whose heart, where a man does his thinking, is his law. As it says in Revelation, to have the Father's name in the forehead is to offer God intelligent obedience. That means to have God's law in the heart, where a man does his thinking. Well, then might the angels rejoice as they looked upon the Savior's cross, when the few loyal humans who were there were weeping, thinking that all was lost, and the disciples were gathering in the upper room to bemoan their defeat. In heaven, you see, they were rejoicing. Well might the angels rejoice as they looked upon the Savior's cross, for though they did not then understand all, they knew that the destruction of sin and Satan was forever made certain, that the redemption of man was assured, and that the universe was made eternally secure, without using force, you see. The presentation of the evidence of his love, his mercy, his righteousness has convinced the great majority in this universe. Christ himself fully comprehended the results of the sacrifice made upon Calvary. To all these he looked forward when upon the cross he cried out, "It is finished." Now, some wonder if the phrase, "the glory of him who is love will destroy them," really refers to something physical that would really consume everything. Well, look at the second one. To sin wherever found, our God is a consuming fire. What is this fire like? Look at the last 4 lines of the second one. At the second advent of Christ, the wicked shall be consumed with the spirit of his mouth and destroyed with the brightness of his coming. The light of the glory of God does not help explain what the glory is. The light of the glory of God, which imparts life to the righteous, will slay the wicked. It's not 2 kinds of glory. God has only one kind. It is life-giving glory. And had the universe remained in harmony with him, we would have enjoyed all the benefits of this energizing, life-giving energy that surrounds the person of God. Then look at number 5. These others are all helpful, I believe. Look especially at 5. The people of Israel, because of their sinfulness, were forbidden to approach the mount when God was about to descend upon it to proclaim his law, lest they should be consumed by the burning glory of his presence. When the divine presence was manifested upon Sinai, the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire in the sight of all Israel. But when Christ shall come in glory with his holy angels, the whole earth shall be ablaze with the terrible light of his presence. It seems quite specific, doesn't it? And that fits in with 2 Peter 3, where he says the very elements will melt with fervent heat. And it would appear to me everything then will be restored or returned to the condition it was in before day 1 of creation week. And that's no place to live So it's nice to think maybe this would be sanctified speculation. We don't have texts for it, but God will recreate the earth. We have texts for that. That he will restore it, he will give us Canaan, he will give us Eden back. And I have often wondered how he might choose to do it. Maybe because there could be among the saints some who are not entirely clear on Genesis 1 and 2. Wouldn't it be just like him to do it the way he did it the first time? And with a smile say, now those of you who had a little question about Genesis 1 and 2, but you've trusted me and you're safe to save, and the mark that you're safe to save is that you're willing to listen and accept correction. I want you to receive a little correction. If you'll just stand here on the walls, I will recreate this earth day 1, 2, 3, right on through. Wouldn't you be happy to give up any idea you ever had about the Genesis 1? Well, that might have been wrong. But then when it comes to Friday, and this earth is as beautiful as it was before. And it's Eden again, because aren't we told that Adam recognizes some of the very vines he had trained with his hands? I don't know how the Lord has preserved those, but that's in the description. And the Lord checks on everything he did back in Genesis, and there's just one thing left: people. Does he need to create people? Why, the New Jerusalem is full of people who've been looking forward to this, and he throws open the pearly gates and invites us to take over possession of Eden again. Now, what would be the only thing left that would be most appropriate to do under those circumstances? Wouldn't it be to celebrate Sabbath? Now, Sabbath doesn't fit any other world. It has to be the right size for that. See, there are some worlds relatively near us that are so big, relatively tiny compared with the rest of the universe, that a Sabbath, a day, is as long as a year. What good would it do to have Sabbath every 7th year? The Sabbath was made for man. We don't know what God has graciously done for the rest of the universe. But we'll still be on the same schedule, won't we? And wouldn't it be appropriate, as that first Friday in the new earth comes to an end, if we should celebrate Sabbath, which would then remind us not only of the original creation and all that has been done to recreate and restore us, but remind us of the total recreation of the world? Why wouldn't then Sabbath be significant to us for the rest of eternity? And that's why Isaiah was not exaggerating when he suggests that from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another, we will worship God for all eternity, the people on this planet. The day would just mean more than it's ever meant before, and would be tied not just to creation, but to everything else God has done, which really is the meaning of the Sabbath. The Sabbath sums up the truth about God. That's what the Sabbath is all about. And won't we know more about God than ever before when we step into Eden made new? So gladly and significantly and appropriately we would keep Sabbath throughout eternity. Would anyone like to suggest it would be legalistic of us once a week to celebrate what God has done and the kind of person he is through eternity? Would anyone feel under pressure? Anyone feel deprived of his freedom? Don't most of our Christian friends suggest that our Sabbath keeping is legalistic? Of course, we can make it that way, and we probably have, and that's why they got the idea sometime. But wouldn't that be the most appropriate thing to do? Wouldn't one gladly do it in the highest sense of freedom if God would gather us in the earth made new and invite us to join with him, who's the happiest person of all, that it's all done? You remember when the prodigal son's brother was indignant at the feast and said, "How have you done this?" And the father replied, "I'm throwing this party because I feel so good." He was happy. That's why he threw the party. Whether the younger brother deserved it or not was not the point. And I think he will gather us every Sabbath because he feels so good. And he loves to reflect on the significance of all this. And we'll join with him. Anyone feel under any arbitrary pressure to join the Lord every Sabbath on this planet throughout eternity? See, it all depends what one reads into the Sabbath and how one understands God. Would you have questions, though, about this conception of the destruction at the end? It's simply God no longer veiling his life-giving glory. How grateful we should be that he's veiling it now, because if he were to unveil his glory, we would be consumed. Only those who are fully in harmony with God can live in that life-giving glory. We thank him then for veiling his glory, though it means living in a dark world. When we're ready, and God wouldn't come till everyone has made up his mind, we're either healed or we're diagnosed as beyond remedy. Let him that is righteous stay that way. Let him that is filthy stay that way. He doesn't have to condemn anybody. He just has to diagnose this. Just announce what he finds. Nothing arbitrary ever about God. And then, since there's no point waiting for anyone else, there's not another patient waiting outside the doctor's door, eager for treatment. Nobody left, desiring any help from God. Then God says, it is finished. And he comes in his life-giving glory. And some of us are energized by this, and others are consumed. Would that leave any serious problems in understanding that, consistent with what we know to be true about God, he still is not angry with the wicked at the end. He's crying over them as they're consumed. Why will you die? How can I give you up? How can I let you go? Does he pour out his wrath? Yes, if wrath equals God's turning away and loving disappointment from those who do not want him anyway, thus leaving them to the inevitable but awful consequences of their own rebellious choice. He's not done that yet. He hasn't given us up. But in the end, he will. He will respect our decision if we prefer to be left alone, but the consequences are unspeakable.